Welcome to my channel, Crimson Inquiry.
London in the last week of November 1891 was steeped in a dreary fog so thick it muffled even the gaslights. From our rooms at Baker Street, one could scarcely distinguish the opposite side of the road. The cold was biting, and the city moved like a dream half lost in mist. It was on such a morning, at precisely 7:15, that Mrs. Hudson rapped hurriedly upon our door, her face pale beneath her bonnet. "A gentleman from Scotland Yard. Mr. Holmes says it's urgent, sir." Inspector Lestrade entered, his boots damp and his expression grim. He removed his hat and shook off the moisture before speaking. "There's been a tragedy, Mr. Holmes, a strange one. Down by the Thames near Blackfriars Bridge. The body of a woman was found at dawn, dressed all in white. The river police thought she'd drowned, but there's not a drop of water in her lungs." Holmes, who had been bent over the morning paper, looked up sharply. His eyes gleamed with sudden animation. "A woman in white by the river? Go on." "Aye," Lestrade said, "and there's something else." In her hand, clutched so tightly they had to pry it loose, was a swan's feather dipped in blood. Watson, who had been stirring his tea, set down the spoon with a clatter. "Good heavens! What do you make of that, Holmes?" Holmes rose, crossing the room with the brisk energy of a man roused from long dormancy. He reached for his coat and hat. "I make of it, my dear Watson, that the Thames has given up a secret, and one far too delicate for the blunt instruments of officialdom. Fetch your revolver and notebook. We are bound for the river." He paused at the doorway, glancing back with a faint, knowing smile, "and if I am not mistaken, this will not be the last feather we find." The fog outside seemed to thicken as we descended the steps of Baker Street. Somewhere beyond that grey veil waited a mystery, one destined to be remembered as the tragedy of the midnight Swan. The fog still hung low over the Thames as our hansom cab rattled along the wet cobblestones, the rhythmic clatter of hooves echoing through the empty streets. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half closed yet alert to every sound. I knew that look well, the peculiar stillness that preceded the whirring of his mental machinery. He had scarcely spoken a word since we left Baker Street, but I could sense the keen anticipation radiating from him. When at last we drew up beside the embankment near Blackfriars Bridge, a scene of quiet confusion awaited us. Two uniformed constables stood guard over a cordoned area along the river's edge, where a small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered despite the cold. The body, mercifully covered by a white sheet, lay upon a stretcher not far from the waterline. The river itself moved sluggishly beneath the bridge, its surface reflecting the faint glimmer of gas lamps like dull silver. Lestrade led us toward the scene, his breath misting in the air. "There she is, gentlemen, found at 5:30 by a lighterman heading for Wapping. No identification, no witnesses, and no sign of a struggle nearby." Holmes lifted the corner of the sheet with a delicate precision, revealing the pale features of a woman perhaps in her 40s. Her expression was peaceful, almost serene, but her lips were faintly blue, and her hands bore a strange stiffness that caught my attention. She was dressed entirely in white, a satin gown of fine make, though soiled at the hem from the riverbank mud. Around her neck hung a silver locket, its chain broken on one side. Holmes observed in silence for a long moment, his eyes flicking from the woman's face to her garments, and then to the stretch of gravel and silt surrounding her. He crouched down, examining the ground with his magnifying lens. "There are footprints here," he murmured, "but not her own. A man's boot, size 8, heavy sole, most likely a tradesman or servant. Observe the depth of the impression. He was carrying weight, perhaps dragging something. Yet, curiously, there is no sign of her own prints approaching from any direction." I glanced about. "You mean she was placed here after death?" "Undoubtedly. The question, Watson, is where she died and how. There are no marks of strangulation, no bruising about the arms, no water in the lungs. Drowning is out of the question. The lividity about the neck and temples suggests poisoning, something subtle, perhaps chloral hydrate, perhaps digitalis. We shall see once the post-mortem confirms it." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "Then why the feather, Holmes? Seems a queer sort of thing for a murderer to leave behind." Holmes stood, brushing off his knees, and gestured for the constable to hand him the evidence bag. Inside, resting on a piece of linen, was a single white feather, large, elegant, and stained at the tip with dried crimson. Holmes examined it under the dim morning light, his gaze sharp and thoughtful. This is not the feather of any common bird, Lestrade. The length, the curvature. It belongs to a mute swan, Cygnus alor, most likely taken from the wing. And notice the blood is not from the bird. It's human, Lestrade blinked. You're saying the killer left it on purpose? Most assuredly. A message, perhaps, or a token of guilt. Holmes slipped the feather back into the bag. We must not underestimate the theatrical inclinations of a criminal mind. As he spoke, the constable who had been standing by the bridge called out, waving an arm. "Sir, something in the water!" We hurried over. Caught against the piling of the bridge was a small object glinting dully beneath the current. A pole was fetched, and after some effort the constable managed to fish it out, a silver hairpin shaped like a swan in flight. Holmes took it carefully, his face alight with interest. "Aha," he murmured, turning it between his fingers. "See here, Watson. The craftsmanship is exquisite, unmistakably handmade. And look, engraved beneath the wing, the initials ER." He tucked the hairpin into his pocket. "Lestrade, send one of your men to every jeweler within a mile radius. We must find who commissioned such a piece." Lestrade nodded briskly and went off to issue instructions, leaving Holmes standing at the edge of the embankment, gazing out across the misty water. I watched him in silence for a moment, sensing that his mind was already racing far ahead of us all. At last he turned to me. "You observe, Watson, that the woman's dress is of a design not worn by the working class, nor by the typical London gentlewoman. The material is French, the stitching delicate. Moreover, the locket, though broken, bears the hallmark of a Hatton Garden jeweller. She was of means, or at least of refinement. Then what business had she here alone by the river at midnight?" "Precisely the question," he said softly. "But the answer, I suspect, lies not in the river, but in what she was running from before she reached it." We returned to the body. Holmes directed the constables to examine the immediate area for discarded items, and within minutes, one of them brought over a small torn envelope. Holmes took it, unfolding the damp paper with great care. Only a few words were still legible upon the ruined surface. "Midnight at the pier. Bring the Swan." The rest was blurred beyond recovery. Holmes's eyes gleamed. So she was summoned here, under pretense perhaps by someone she trusted. I bent to study the words. "And the Swan. Do you think it refers to the feather or the hairpin?" "Neither," Holmes replied quietly. "I believe it refers to herself." He glanced toward the river again, his profile etched against the fog like a carving of pale stone. "There was once a music hall performer known as the Midnight Swan, a singer of some fame, though I recall she vanished from the stage years ago after a scandal involving a nobleman's son. Watson, fetch your notebook. We have a name to uncover." The constables began preparing to move the body, and Lestrade returned, reporting that no one in the immediate neighborhood had seen or heard anything unusual. Holmes merely nodded, then motioned for me to follow him back toward the waiting cab. "Where to now?" I asked. "To Covent Garden," he said promptly. If memory serves, the Golden Lily Theatre once hosted a singer known by that very epithet. It is possible our unfortunate lady once trod those boards. If so, someone there will remember her, and perhaps the man who destroyed her. As the cab rolled away from the river, I could not help glancing back at the mist-covered water, where the feather had first been found. The chill of the air seemed to follow us, clinging like a premonition. Holmes sat silently beside me, his eyes distant yet unrelenting. "There is design in this tragedy, Watson," he said at last, almost to himself. "And like all art, it will reveal its author, if only one knows where to look." The cab rattled through the waking streets of London, its wheels hissing against the damp stones. The fog had begun to lift, revealing the pale outlines of lamplighters and the first stirrings of market vendors preparing their stalls. Holmes sat motionless beside me, the lapels of his coat turned up, his gaze fixed through the window as though reading invisible signs in the drifting mist. The rhythmic clatter of hooves was the only sound between us until he spoke, softly but with a curious intensity. "Watson, have you ever reflected upon the peculiar vanity of criminals? They leave their signature not out of arrogance alone, but from a perverse desire to be understood, to be admired even." He tapped his fingers lightly on his knee. The feather, the white attire, the name, the Midnight Swan, all the marks of an aesthetic mind. This was not a crime of impulse, but of design. I said nothing. sensing that his thoughts were in motion and best left undisturbed. At last the cab drew up before the Golden Lily Theatre, an aging yet elegant building tucked between two tall warehouses on Drury Lane. Its once bright facade had dimmed with neglect, but traces of its past grandeur remained. The gilt lettering on the windows, the heavy velvet curtains drawn across the doorway, the faint scent of dust and grease paint lingering in the air. Inside, the theatre was quiet, save for the echo of our footsteps. Our caretaker appeared, a thin, elderly man with stooped shoulders and eyes that flicked nervously between us. Holmes introduced himself with the air of official certainty that so often parted obstacles. "Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, consulting with the Yard. We are making inquiries concerning a performer once employed here, a lady known by the stage name The Midnight Swan." The old man frowned, scratching his chin. "Ah, yes, sir. I recall her. Miss Eveline Rowe, that was her real name. Beautiful voice she had too, though her story ended rather unhappily." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Unhappily, you say?" The caretaker nodded. "She was popular for a time, until she left the stage rather suddenly. There was talk of a gentleman, a patron from some fine family, name never spoken outright. He financed her shows for months, then vanished, and she with him. When she returned a year later, she was changed. Wouldn't sing again. Only came once more to the theatre, late one night, to collect a trunk from her dressing room. That was 3 years ago, maybe 4. Did she leave anything behind?" Holmes asked. The man thought for a moment, then motioned us to follow him down a narrow corridor, lined with framed posters. We entered a small dressing room at the end, its mirrors tarnished and its walls faded from years of neglect. The air smelled faintly of old perfume. The caretaker gestured toward a wooden trunk beneath the dressing table. That belonged to her. We kept it, thinking she might return, but she never did. Holmes knelt at once, examining the lock. It had rusted slightly, but he produced a small tool from his pocket and opened it with practiced ease. Inside lay a collection of yellowed playbills, a few wilted feathers from an old costume, and a velvet jewelry case. He opened the case with care, revealing an empty space where something once rested. Only the faint impression of a delicate shape remained in the velvet, a swan perhaps identical to the hairpin we had recovered from the river. "Curious," he murmured. She kept the case but not the trinket, meaning it had value beyond ornament, emotional or otherwise. He glanced up at the caretaker. "Did she ever receive visitors after her return?" The man shook his head. "Only one, sir, a gentleman, tall, well-dressed, though I never caught his name. Came late at night, the same night she took her things. They argued. I heard voices from the corridor, but she left before morning. I remember because she was crying when she went." Holmes stood, brushing his hands together. "You have been most helpful. If you recall any further detail, no matter how small, inform Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard." He pressed a coin into the man's palm and we took our leave. Once outside, Holmes paused by the curb, his eyes bright with inward fire. "Eveline Rowe," he said quietly. "A fallen songbird, drawn once more into the snare of her past. The question, Watson, is, who was the man that lured her to the river under false pretenses? A lover, a blackmailer, or something altogether more sinister? Do you believe he is the same gentleman she quarreled with here?" "I asked, undoubtedly," Holmes replied. "But his identity must be confirmed through fact, not conjecture. Let us trace her life backward. Where did she reside after leaving the stage? If we find her lodgings, we may find the missing link between the theatre and the Thames." We hailed another cab and soon found ourselves in the quieter quarters of Bloomsbury, where artists and modest professionals made their homes. Holmes' inquiries at several boarding houses led us at last to a Mrs. Lanchester, a matronly woman who remembered Eveline Rowe distinctly. "Yes, sir. She rented the upper room for nearly 2 years. Always quiet, paid regular. Had a piano brought in. Oh, how she used to play in the evenings. But these last few weeks she'd seemed troubled. Received letters that left her pale as death. Then, night before last, she went out dressed all in white, said she was meeting an old friend and never came back." Holmes requested permission to inspect the room, and Mrs. Lanchester led us upstairs. The small chamber bore signs of a hurried departure. A shawl tossed carelessly over a chair, a cup of tea long dried upon the table, and a single envelope resting beside the piano keys. Holmes picked it up, examining the front. It was addressed simply E. Rowe, Golden Lily Theatre. No sender's name, but the postmark bore the crest of an estate in Richmond. Richmond, Holmes murmured, a district of wealth and discretion. Let us see who among its residents once fancied himself a patron of the arts. He slipped the letter into his pocket and turned his attention to the piano. Several sheets of music lay scattered across the stand. I noticed something peculiar, a small ink blot beside one title, The Swan's Lament. Holmes followed my gaze and smiled faintly. Indeed, Watson. Even in art, truth leaves its spoor. This composition, it was written in her own hand, and here, beneath the last line of notation, she has written 2 words barely visible. He leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. Forgive me. We stood in silence for a moment, the air heavy with the residue of tragedy. At last Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. Despair may drive one to folly, but despair does not place a feather in one's dead hand. No, Watson. Someone turned her remorse into theatre. Someone wished to frame her death as a symbol, perhaps as vengeance or possession. He moved to the window and peered through the fog at the street below. The Richmond letter is our next step. I suspect we shall find the name of her benefactor, and perhaps the author of this grim performance. As we left the boarding house, I saw Holmes glance once more at the sky, where the faintest light of morning struggled through the fog. His voice, when he spoke, carried both curiosity and something colder. The swan, my dear Watson, sings before it dies. But in this case, I fear the melody is not yet over. The cab ride to Richmond was a long and silent one. Outside, the morning fog had thinned into a pale drizzle, softening the outlines of the grand villas and iron gates that lined the avenue. I watched as the city's soot-stained buildings gave way to green hedgerows and stately homes, each surrounded by manicured lawns and winter-bare trees. Holmes sat opposite me, the envelope from Eveline Rowe's room balanced delicately in his gloved hands. He studied the embossed crest on its back, with the air of a man examining a fossilized clue to a vanished age. The mark upon the seal, he said at last, belongs to the Darnley family, the House of Darnley of Richmond Park. They have held property there for nearly 2 centuries. Old money with new scandals, if I am not mistaken. He smiled faintly, eyes glinting beneath the brim of his hat. Our next conversation, Watson, may prove most delicate. The Darnleys are not accustomed to having their affairs dissected by consulting detectives. I nodded, though inwardly I wondered what sort of connection might bind a celebrated singer and a family of such repute. The answer came soon enough, for when we arrived at the gates of the Darnley estate, a sprawling manor of grey stone and ivy, we were met by a young man whose bearing and manner left no doubt of his lineage. He was tall with refined features and the unmistakable air of one raised to command. Yet there was an uneasiness in his eyes, a shadow that betrayed something less than innocence. "I am Reginald Darnley," he said stiffly, when Holmes presented his card. "You wished to speak with me concerning Miss Eveline Rowe. I must confess I had not expected the matter to reach your notice so swiftly." Holmes inclined his head in polite acknowledgement. "Then you admit to an acquaintance with the deceased?" Darnley's expression faltered. "I do. Miss Rowe was a friend once. I heard of her death this morning, a terrible business, and I assure you, Mr. Holmes, I am as shocked as anyone." Holmes studied him for a long, silent moment before speaking again. "You corresponded with her recently. A letter bearing your family crest was found in her room. Might I inquire as to its contents?" The young man hesitated, glancing toward the great oak doors of the house as if to ensure no one else was listening. "It was a private matter," he said finally. "But since her name has already been dragged through the papers before, I shall tell you. Miss Rowe and I were engaged some years ago in a friendship, one my family disapproved of most strongly. She was spirited, intelligent, and undeserving of the treatment she endured. I wrote to her only to make amends, to ask her forgiveness for the past." Holmes's gaze remained steady. "And did she agree to meet you?" "Yes," Darnley admitted. "Last evening, near the river. It was her choice of place, not mine. She said she had something to return, a token of our old friendship. I went as promised, but when I arrived she was gone. I waited half an hour, then left. That is all." "Curious," Holmes murmured. "For the police recovered upon her person a feather, blood-stained, and a broken chain as if torn in struggle. You saw nothing unusual in the vicinity?" "Nothing." The fog was thick. "I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I left her alive." The denial came too quickly, too defensively. I saw Holmes's eyes narrow, though his voice remained calm. "And this token she mentioned, and what was it?" A pause. "A trinket I once gave her," Darnley said after the briefest hesitation. "A hairpin in the shape of a swan." Holmes' brows lifted a fraction, though he betrayed no surprise. "Indeed. Then you are aware that the same hairpin was found later that night, caught beneath the bridge near where her body was discovered?" Darnley blanched. "Good God! You cannot think—" "I think nothing yet," Holmes interrupted. "I merely observe. Tell me, Mr. Darnley, did anyone else know of your meeting?" The young man shook his head, visibly shaken now. "No one. I gave her my word of discretion." Holmes regarded him in silence for several seconds, then offered a courteous bow. "I thank you for your candor. You will, of course, remain within reach should the Yard wish to question you further." As we turned to leave, I heard Darnley's voice falter behind us. "Mr. Holmes, if she was murdered, I beg you, find who did it. Whatever faults I may have, I would not harm Eveline." Holmes gave no answer until we were well outside the gates. Then he said, "An intelligent liar is far more dangerous than a foolish one, Watson. Darnley spoke truth in fragments, but not in full. Note his emphasis on forgiveness. A man who fears exposure often cloaks it in remorse. You believe he is guilty?" "Not necessarily, but he conceals something vital. The true hand behind this tragedy may yet stand in his shadow." He hailed a passing cab and we stepped inside. "To Scotland Yard," he instructed the driver. "There is a pattern here I must test against the Yard's records." The drive back into the city passed swiftly. At the Yard, Lestrade received us with his usual blend of irritation and curiosity. "You've been busy, Holmes," he said. "Word just came down. The medical examiner's report on the woman from the Thames. Cause of death, poison, as you suspected. Chloral hydrate mixed with brandy. Administered shortly before death. No signs of struggle." "Excellent," Holmes said briskly. "And the locket?" Lestrade handed him a small evidence pouch. Inside were 2 photographs. One of Miss Rowe, the other of that Darnley fellow, younger by a few years. "Seems you were right about the connection." Holmes examined the photographs, then slipped them into his pocket. "Tell me, Lestrade, was there anything else on her person?" "A note, perhaps?" Lestrade frowned. "Only a ticket stub. Music hall performance, dated the night before her death. The name on it, The Swan's Last Song. Ever heard of it?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Not until now, but it appears our murderer has a fondness for symbolism." He turned to me suddenly, the light of realization dawning in his eyes. "Watson, think. She was summoned to the river under the pretext of returning a token. Yet the token itself, the swan pin, ends up discarded in the water. The locket is broken, not lost, and now we find this ticket, pointing to a performance she may never have attended. No, the affair is not as simple as a lover's rendezvous gone wrong. This was staged, carefully, theatrically, with an artist's sense for drama." "And the artist?" I asked. "Precisely what we must learn," Holmes replied. "Someone orchestrated this as one composes a piece of music, each note placed to evoke a specific emotion. The feather, the costume, even the choice of location, all deliberate. We are dealing with a mind that craves control." Lestrade folded his arms. "You think Darnley's covering for someone?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Possibly. Or he himself is the puppet of another. I shall know more when I speak to the proprietor of this so-called Swan's Last Song. Send one of your men to fetch any information on the performance and its composer." Lestrade gave a curt nod and hurried off. Holmes turned to me, lowering his voice. "If my instincts are correct, Watson, the answer lies not with Darnley alone, but with whoever exploited his guilt. We may soon discover that Eveline Rowe's final performance was written not for applause, but for revenge." Outside, the fog had thickened once again, curling around the lamps like ghostly fingers. Holmes paused at the Yard's door, his silhouette framed by the pale glow of the street. "Come, my dear fellow," he said, his tone almost grim. "The curtain has only just risen on this tragedy, and I have every intention of discovering who wrote its final act." The following morning found us at breakfast in Baker Street, though Holmes, as usual, seemed more interested in the residue of his thoughts than in the meal before him. The fire crackled steadily, fighting the damp chill that crept in through the fog-streaked windows. My companion sat with his violin resting across his knees, plucking at a single string absently, while his gaze drifted toward the hearth. His coffee had gone cold untouched when a sharp knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade, his overcoat still glistening from the rain. "Morning, Mr. Holmes, Doctor," he said briskly. "I've brought that information you asked for. About the Swan's last song." Holmes's eyes lit with sudden animation. "Excellent, Lestrade. You are becoming almost indispensable. Pray enlighten us." Lestrade drew a small notebook from his pocket. "Turns out it wasn't a public show at all. More of a private performance, given at the Albemarle Club 2 nights before the lady's death. Exclusive affair, invitation only. Organized by a fellow named Geoffrey Linton, composer, patron of the arts, and something of a recluse. The performance was meant as a preview of his new piece, but there's a queer detail. The title on the program was The Swan's Last Song, but the theme was said to be death, forgiveness, and rebirth. Some who attended said it felt more like a funeral than a concert." Holmes's fingers stilled on the violin string. "Geoffrey Linton," he repeated softly. "Yes, I know the name. A composer of no small talent, but notorious for eccentricities, particularly his fascination with symbolism and the macabre. He once held an exhibition in which the guests were required to walk through a room draped in mourning veils before hearing his music. I dare say such theatrics appeal to certain minds. Tell me, Lestrade, was Reginald Darnley among those invited?" "He was," Lestrade confirmed. "Attended with 2 others, a Lady Brackenbury and a Mr. Felix Hargreaves. Both regulars at the club. Darnley left before the end of the performance, according to the staff." "Curious," Holmes murmured. "A man revisits a ghost from his past and attends a performance bearing her symbol, the swan. 2 days later she is found dead holding a feather. Coincidence? Hardly." He rose from his chair with renewed vigor. "Watson, coat and hat if you please. We are calling upon Mr. Geoffrey Linton." Lestrade frowned. "You think he's involved?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that a man who composes death in melody may not resist composing it in life." Within the hour, we were at Linton's residence in Chelsea, a narrow townhouse overlooking the river, its windows half-shuttered despite the morning light. A maid admitted us into a dimly lit drawing-room, heavy with the scent of turpentine and stale smoke. Music scores lay scattered across the piano, their pages marked in red ink. Paintings of strange ghostly figures hung upon the walls, women draped in white, each depicted in a different pose of sorrow. After a moment, the composer himself appeared. Geoffrey Linton was a tall man in his 50s, with streaks of silver in his hair and a long, melancholy face. His eyes, dark and deep-set, regarded Holmes with polite curiosity. "Mr. Holmes, is it? I have heard of you. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "To a performance of yours, Mr. Linton," Holmes replied smoothly. "The Swan's Last Song. I'm told it was your latest work." Linton's lips curved into a faint smile. "Ah, yes. My little requiem. A meditation on endings, not for the faint-hearted. But surely you did not come merely to critique my composition." Holmes' eyes glittered. "Indeed not. I came because your title, and perhaps your inspiration, seem uncomfortably close to the death of a certain lady, Miss Eveline Rowe." The composer's expression did not change, though a slight tightening of the jaw betrayed the effect of the name. "Eveline Rowe," he said slowly. "Yes, I knew her. She was my muse once. My midnight swan, as the papers like to call her. A voice unlike any other. But that was years ago. Yet her memory lingers," Holmes observed, glancing toward a portrait on the wall, a young woman in white, painted with haunting precision. "And you immortalized her, I see." Linton's tone grew cool. "I immortalize what moves me, Mr. Holmes. Eveline was one such creature, but I have not spoken to her in years. If she is dead as you suggest, then London has lost a rare soul." Holmes walked slowly across the room, examining the scattered sheets of music. "You will forgive my bluntness, Mr. Linton, but the parallels between your performance and her death are striking. The feather, the costume, even the symbolism of the swan, all mirror your work. Did you by chance invite her to your performance?" Linton hesitated, just long enough for Holmes to notice. "I did," he said finally. "Anonymously." She declined to reply. "I confess I hoped she might attend, not for vanity's sake, but closure. You see, it was I who introduced her to Reginald Darnley. Their liaison ended poorly, and she blamed me. Perhaps rightly so." Holmes turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Indeed. Then you are the link between the composer and the heir. A curious triangle. Tell me, where were you on the night of her death? At home, Linton said without a flicker of hesitation. Alone. I was working late on the final bars of my composition. You may confirm it with my maid, though I doubt she was awake to hear the music. Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then inclined his head slightly. I shall do so. One final question, if I may. This feather motif so central to your work. Why the swan? Linton's gaze drifted to the portrait again. Because the swan sings before it dies, Mr. Holmes. It is beauty's final defiance. Miss Rowe understood that. She once told me she wished to die while her voice was still pure. His tone softened to a whisper. Perhaps she got her wish. Holmes said nothing, but his eyes flashed with sudden intensity. I knew the sign well. A spark of deduction catching fire behind that impassive mask. Thank you for your time, Mr. Linton, he said briskly. You have been most enlightening. As we stepped back into the fog outside, I could not restrain my question. Holmes, do you believe him? To a degree, Holmes replied, but his truth is incomplete. He speaks like a man haunted, not by guilt alone, but by anticipation. He expected this tragedy, Watson, perhaps even orchestrated it indirectly. What artist could resist seeing his own vision made real? We had scarcely reached the corner when a boy from the telegraph office came running down the street calling Holmes's name. He handed over a folded note, which Holmes tore open at once. His face darkened as he read. It's from Lestrade, he said quickly. They've found something at the river. A second body. Another? I exclaimed. Yes, male, middle-aged, unidentified. But in his pocket, a torn program from the Swan's last song. Holmes hailed a cab with sudden urgency. Come, Watson. The curtain has lifted on Act 2, and I fear the encore will be deadly. The fog over the Thames clung to the air like a living thing, swallowing the lamplight and muffling the sounds of the waking city. When Holmes and I arrived at the embankment, Lestrade was already there, his boots slick with river mud and his expression grave. The constables had cordoned off a section near the water, where two men were hauling up a stretcher from the shallows. Even before we approached, I saw the pale shape of the drowned man beneath the tarp, one arm exposed, the hand clenched tightly as though holding on to something even in death. Holmes crouched beside the stretcher the instant it was set down, his gaze sweeping over the body with clinical precision. Middle-aged, he murmured. Broad-shouldered, well-fed, likely a man of means. The hands are calloused, yet the fingernails are clean, suggesting recent manual exertion but not habitual labor. The face, Watson, look, there's bruising about the throat. He didn't drown by accident. He was strangled and thrown in. Lestrade nodded grimly. We pulled this from his pocket. He handed Holmes a crumpled scrap of thick paper, half of a concert program still legible despite the damp. The words of the Swan's last song were visible across the torn edge. Just as you said, Holmes muttered. Another link in the chain. He unfolded the man's clenched hand with delicate care, revealing a small, curved object between the fingers, a golden cufflink fashioned in the shape of a swan's head. Holmes's expression sharpened. Lestrade, where exactly was the body found? Near the foot of Battersea Bridge, the inspector replied. Tide must have carried it down from upstream. We're checking if anyone's been reported missing. Holmes' eyes flicked briefly toward the river, calculating. Upstream. Near Chelsea, perhaps? Conveniently close to Geoffrey Linton's residence. You think the composer had him killed? Lestrade asked. I think, Holmes said slowly, turning the cufflink over in his hand, that someone is orchestrating a performance that has yet to reach its crescendo. But the question, Lestrade, is whether Linton is the composer, or merely one of the instruments. As we spoke, the clouds broke briefly, and a sliver of cold light touched the water. I caught the faint glint of something metallic near the edge of the embankment. Holmes noticed it too. Hold there, he called and bent swiftly to retrieve it. A small silver locket, half open, with a miniature portrait inside. The image showed a young woman, Eveline Rowe. Unmistakably, but opposite her was a man's likeness, faintly water-damaged, yet recognizable even through the smudged paint. I started as I realized it resembled Geoffrey Linton. Interesting, Holmes murmured. A token of affection, perhaps. But notice the hinge is broken as though torn violently. Someone didn't want these two faces to remain together. He snapped the locket shut. Watson, This may yet prove the missing harmony between our players. We accompanied Lestrade back to Scotland Yard, where the drowned man's identity was soon confirmed through a watch found in his coat. His name was Felix Hargreaves, one of the very men Lestrade had mentioned attending Linton's concert with Reginald Darnley. Holmes paced the inspector's office, deep in thought. So Hargreaves, Darnley, Brackenbury, all linked to that performance. 2 are now dead. The first, Eveline Rowe, tied to both Darnley and Linton by the past. The second, Hargreaves discovered with her image upon him. Tell me, Lestrade, what of Lady Brackenbury? She's at her estate in Hampstead. I can send a constable to fetch her. No, Holmes said sharply. We shall go to her ourselves. The pattern suggests she will be next, and I would rather question her while she yet breathes. It was nearing dusk when we arrived at Lady Brackenbury's residence, a stately, ivy-clad mansion at the edge of Hampstead Heath. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke from distant chimneys. A nervous butler led us to the drawing-room, where Lady Brackenbury awaited us. She was a tall, imperious woman in her 40s, dressed impeccably, but her composure faltered the moment Holmes mentioned the name Eveline Rowe. I thought I'd heard the last of her, she said quietly. But of course, one never escapes ghosts, does one, Mr. Holmes? Holmes inclined his head. You knew her well, then? Well enough. She was engaged to Darnley once, until he threw her over for the daughter of a baronet. I was there when it happened. Eveline swore vengeance, but later she changed, became quiet, withdrawn. When she reappeared at the concert last week, I hardly recognized her. She looked resolved. Reappeared, I asked. Then she did attend the performance? Yes, Lady Brackenbury said. She sat at the back, veiled. I thought she came to forgive him. She spoke to me afterward. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were calm. She said, "The Swan sings only once, my lady. Tell him that when I am gone he will hear the echo." I assumed she meant it poetically. Holmes's gaze darkened. "And did you see Hargreaves that evening?" I did. He seemed troubled, kept glancing toward her, whispering to Darnley. They left early, the 3 of them. I stayed behind. Holmes nodded slowly, the lines of the puzzle forming in his mind. "Tell me, Lady Brackenbury, do you recall anything about the music itself?" She frowned slightly. It was haunting, a single theme repeated again and again. But in the final movement, there was a phrase, 2 notes that struck like a cry. Mr. Linton called it the dying voice. He said it was inspired by the last breath of a swan. Holmes rose, his decision immediate. "Watson, we return to Linton at once. There is more written in his music than melody. I suspect his final bars may conceal the very key to this mystery." The journey back to Chelsea was tense. The fog thickened once more, turning the gaslights into smudged halos of gold. Linton's house loomed ahead, its windows dark, the door half ajar. Holmes motioned for silence as we stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of candle wax and something acrid, burnt paper. In the study the hearth still glowed with dying embers. Sheets of manuscript lay scattered across the floor, some half-burned, others torn. On the piano rested a single page of music, untouched by the flames. Holmes lifted it gently, his eyes scanning the notes. "It's the finale," he whispered. "Look here, Watson," beneath the musical notation. These faint impressions, letters written in pencil between the staves. He tilted the sheet toward the firelight. The message was barely legible but unmistakable. "Forgive me. The Swan is not dead, it flies at midnight." Before I could speak, a faint creak sounded above us, footsteps on the landing. Holmes raised a hand, his expression suddenly fierce. "Watson," he said softly, "we are no longer alone in this house." Holmes's eyes flicked upward, sharp and alert, his whole body turning still as stone. The faint sound of movement above, the soft groan of a floorboard, was unmistakable. I reached instinctively for my revolver, but Holmes motioned for silence. He took a candle from the mantel and with deliberate slowness began ascending the stairs, the flame throwing tall, wavering shadows along the walls. Each step seemed to echo in the heavy quiet of the house, until even the ticking of the hall clock faded beneath the weight of our anticipation. At the top of the staircase, the corridor stretched long and dim, lined with closed doors. One stood slightly ajar, and from within came a faint rustle, fabric brushing against wood. Holmes advanced soundlessly, the candlelight flickering across his pale, intent face. He pushed the door open with the tip of his cane. Inside, the room lay in partial darkness, save for the pale light filtering through lace curtains. A figure stood by the desk, hurriedly shoving papers into a leather satchel. "Good evening, Mr. Linton," Holmes said quietly. The composer froze, the satchel slipping from his hands. His eyes, wide with shock, darted to the door and then back to Holmes. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, voice trembling. "You've no right—" "On the contrary," Holmes interrupted, stepping fully into the room. "I have every right when two people are dead, and a third may soon follow. You are about to destroy the last of your compositions. That, I suspect, would be most inconvenient for our understanding of recent events." Linton's face went ashen. "You don't understand," he stammered. "It's not what it seems. I didn't kill them. I only wrote the music." Holmes' gaze hardened. "Ah, but music, like words, can conceal motives, can it not? Here's Swan's last song, a convenient title. Two of your patrons lie dead, each tied to the same performance, and now your sheet music burns in your hearth. You must agree it plays a rather sinister tune." Linton's composure broke. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "You think me a murderer," he said hoarsely. "But I swear to you I meant only to expose them. All of them." "Expose them?" I asked. "To what end?" He looked up then, his eyes haunted. "Do you know what that concert was, Doctor?" It was not art, it was a mask. The men who funded it, Darnley, Hargreaves, Brackenbury, they were all part of a private society. They called it the Order of the Swan. They met in secret, under the pretext of supporting music and charity, but in truth it was corruption, bribery, blackmail, even the ruin of reputations. Eveline was their victim once. They used her, destroyed her career, her name. She came to me because she wanted justice. I believed I could give it to her, through art, through revelation. But she went too far. Holmes's expression remained unreadable, though I saw the spark of understanding kindle in his eyes. "You speak of justice and exposure," he said. "But instead of unveiling them, they are dying one by one. That hardly seems the act of a reformer." Linton rose abruptly, agitated. "I didn't kill them. Eveline said she would forgive but not forget. She came to me weeks ago before the concert. She asked me to help her write her final piece, a song of confession. I thought she meant it metaphorically, a form of catharsis. But the night before she died, she sent me a note. It said, 'When the swan sings, they will know what they have done.'" Holmes drew the folded music sheet from his pocket, the one he had found in the study. "Then perhaps you can explain this. The swan is not dead, it flies at midnight. What does that mean?" Linton took the paper, his hands trembling. "That's not mine," he whispered. "I never wrote those words." He turned it over and his breath caught. "This isn't my handwriting, it's hers." Before we could question him further, a sharp rap echoed from the front door downstairs, followed by a shout. Lestrade's voice carried up the stairwell. "Holmes! Watson, are you in there?" Holmes motioned for Linton to stay put and hurried down, his coat flaring behind him. Lestrade entered, his face drawn with urgency. "You'd best come quick, Holmes. Lady Brackenbury. She's been found dead in her carriage outside her estate, strangled just like the others." For a moment silence fell. Then Holmes spoke, calm but edged with steel. "Then the circle closes. Every member of the Order of the Swan has paid the same price. Everyone except our composer." Linton, who had followed us down, shook his head violently. "No, you must believe me, I didn't do this." "I never left my house tonight." Holmes's gaze bore into him. "Then someone wishes to make it appear as though you did. The question is, who profits most by the deaths of these men and women?" Lestrade turned toward the door. "We've got constables stationed around the estate. If you want to see the scene, best hurry. The body's still there." Holmes slipped on his gloves. "Watson, bring your bag. Mr. Linton, you will remain here under guard. I trust you will not attempt another bonfire in my absence." The carriage ride to Hampstead was cloaked in tension. Holmes sat rigid, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. I could tell his mind was racing, connecting fragments faster than speech could follow. When at last he spoke, it was in that low, deliberate tone that signaled the pieces were nearly in place. "3 deaths, all connected by guilt," he said. "Each bound to the same secret society. Each death preceded by a token, a feather, a phrase, a musical motif. It is almost ritualistic. Yet if Linton tells the truth, he is being played as carefully as one of his compositions. I nodded. But who then conducts the orchestra? Holmes smiled faintly. That, my dear Watson, is what we are about to discover. Lady Brackenbury's carriage was found half sunk in the mud by the edge of the heath. The horses had bolted, leaving it tilted against a stone marker. Inside, the lady lay slumped, her gloves torn, her throat marked by the same cruel pressure we had seen before. But something new glimmered upon her lap, a small ivory box tied with a crimson ribbon. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a single white feather, and a note written in elegant hand. "The final song begins." Holmes studied it for a long moment, his expression tightening. So, the killer believes the performance unfinished. He knelt to inspect the floor of the carriage, running his fingers along the scattered straw. "Interesting," he murmured. "See here, Watson, a trace of dark powder, scarcely visible. Coal dust mixed with oil. Not something one expects from a lady's coachman. Where then might one find such a residue?" "At the railway yards," I said. "Precisely." Holmes straightened, eyes glinting in the torchlight. "And where does one go by rail at midnight, when the Swan is said to fly?" I hesitated. "You think the message was literal?" "I think," he replied, "our murderer has a penchant for theatrical flourish. The next act begins at the stroke of 12. We shall be in attendance." He turned toward Lestrade. "Gather your men and meet me at Paddington Station. Tonight, my dear Watson, the Swan shall indeed take flight, and we shall see whether it soars or falls." The fog over the city had thickened into a near impenetrable wall by the time we reached Paddington. Midnight approached, and the lamps along Praed Street burned in halos of blurred light, each one smudged by the swirling mist. The station, though quiet at that late hour, seemed to hum with a strange, restless energy. A few night porters moved about with lanterns, their voices echoing faintly beneath the high iron arches. Somewhere far off, a locomotive hissed, exhaling steam like a great sleeping beast. Holmes stepped from the cab first, his coat collar turned up against the cold. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, his voice barely above the wind. "The entire city sleeps, and yet something stirs in its veins tonight. The killer promised a finale, and if my calculations are correct, it will be played here." Lestrade joined us, his men spreading out through the shadowed platforms, their boots clattering softly on the stones. "We've got constables posted at every entrance," he said. "No one comes or goes without being seen." Holmes smiled thinly. "And yet, my dear Lestrade, it is precisely when all eyes are watching that the cleverest of villains will slip through unseen. Let us remain alert but flexible. Our quarry is not a man of brute strength. They are a creature of design, of poetry. This will be a performance, not a struggle." He led us down the platform, scanning each carriage of the waiting trains. Most were empty, their doors locked for the night, but one, an old first-class coach, stood with its door slightly ajar. Holmes stopped, his head cocked to one side. "Do you hear that?" At first I heard nothing beyond the hiss of steam. Then faintly the sound came, a few notes from a violin drawn soft and slow, almost mournful. It rose and fell like a whisper in the dark. Holmes moved swiftly toward the carriage, gesturing for silence. Inside, the dim glow of a single lantern revealed a solitary figure sitting near the far end, bowing the instrument with deliberate, aching care. It was Eveline Rowe. I gasped, my heart pounding. But she was dead. Dead by the river, her body examined by the police and laid to rest. Yet here she sat, pale and composed, her veil drawn back, her eyes fixed upon us with a serenity that chilled the blood. Holmes raised his hand, not in surprise but in acknowledgement, as if confirming a suspicion he had harbored all along. "Miss Rowe," he said quietly, "or perhaps I should say the lady who plays her part. You've chosen a fine stage for your curtain call." The woman smiled faintly, lowering her bow. "I wondered if you would come, Mr. Holmes. You've been most attentive, but you are too late. The music has already begun." Before I could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed behind us, heavy, purposeful. Lestrade's men turned, their lanterns swinging toward the shadows at the far end of the platform. From the fog emerged another figure, a tall man in a dark coat, his gloved hands clasping a revolver. Linton. He looked disheveled, his face pale, his expression that of a man driven beyond reason. "Step away from her," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You don't know what she's done." Holmes didn't move. "Ah, Mr. Linton, You arrived precisely on cue. I suspected that note found in your study was bait, meant to draw us all together. The stage is complete. Composer, muse, and conductor. Linton's hand trembled. She's not Eveline. She's her sister, Clara Rowe. She's been behind this from the beginning. It was her vengeance, not Eveline's. Eveline died years ago by her own hand. This woman took her name and her face to destroy us all. Clara's smile deepened, cold and unflinching. We destroyed her first, she said. You and your noble patrons, the Order of the Swan. You ruined her, used her, left her to die in shame. I swore I would make you all answer for it. Holmes moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. By staging your vengeance as a symphony of death. A performance that mirrored her final piece, each note a life extinguished, each death a movement in your grand composition. Yes, she whispered, because only music endures. They will remember the song long after the names are forgotten. Linton raised the pistol, his voice breaking. You don't understand. She'll kill again. She planned to destroy everything tonight. This station, the trains, everyone here. She set the charges. Holmes's head snapped around. Charges? The low, distant hum began to rise, barely audible at first, then swelling to a sharp metallic rattle. Beneath the floorboards I felt the faint tremor of machinery, wheels turning, gears locking. Holmes lunged toward Clara, wrenching the violin from her hands. It clattered to the floor, splitting open upon impact. From its hollow body spilled not strings, but a small mechanism of wires and clockwork, its ticking steady and merciless. Good Lord, I breathed. A detonator! Holmes seized the device and pulled a fine copper wire free, his fingers working with furious precision. The ticking faltered, then stopped. A long silence followed, broken only by Clara's laugh, a brittle, shattered sound that echoed through the station. You think that was the only one? She said. The others are beneath the platforms. When the clock strikes 12, the Swan will finally fly. Holmes turned to Lestrade. Clear the station, now! The inspector barked orders, and his men scattered, shouting through the fog. Passengers and porters fled in panic, their figures vanishing into the haze. Holmes, meanwhile, tore open the violin casing again, tracing the direction of the wires. Watson, help me follow this lead. The power source must be nearby. We scrambled along the platform, crouching beside the rails. Holmes' lantern beam flickered across a narrow trench beneath the boards, where a line of connected wires ran toward the far end of the station. We followed it to a maintenance shed beside the water tank. Inside, stacked among crates, was a wooden box fitted with a complex array of clockwork timers, each ticking toward midnight. Holmes drew a deep breath, his hands steady as he examined the mechanism. Crude but effective, she planned to ignite the gas main running beneath the yard. One spark, and half of Paddington would vanish in a cloud of fire. He set to work at once, severing wires, adjusting gears, muttering rapid calculations under his breath. I stood ready with my revolver, though against time itself it seemed a futile gesture. At last, with a sharp click, the final timer stopped. Holmes straightened, sweat glistening on his brow despite the cold. It is done, he said softly. Outside we heard Lestrade's men shouting again, then silence. When we returned to the platform, Clara Rowe stood between two constables, her face pale but composed. Linton, trembling, had dropped his pistol and collapsed onto the bench, weeping. Holmes regarded them both with a strange sadness. Two artists, each blinded by devotion, to a memory, to an ideal, to revenge. You have both composed tragedies, but the world will hear only silence. Clara looked up at him, her voice low. You saved them, but you cannot silence the song. It will be played again someday. Holmes turned away, his expression unreadable. Perhaps, he said quietly, but not tonight. As we stepped out into the cold mist, the clock above the station struck 12. The sound echoed through the emptiness, like the final note of a requiem, fading into the distance as the fog swallowed the city once more. The fog that had blanketed London that evening seemed to grow thicker as the case advanced, shrouding Baker Street in a spectral calm that mirrored the tension within the minds of its two occupants. Holmes stood at the hearth, his sharp gaze fixed not upon the flames, but upon a single item lying upon the mantelpiece, the swan-shaped locket retrieved from Lady Cavendish's estate. Its delicate design glimmered faintly in the firelight, as though it carried secrets of its own. Watson, seated opposite, broke the silence. "You've hardly spoken since we returned, Holmes. Surely the discovery of that letter hidden within the piano should have confirmed your suspicions." Holmes did not immediately reply. Instead, he moved closer to the mantel, his long fingers tracing the outline of the locket. "It confirmed only that there are two minds at work here, Watson," he said at last, his tone measured but taut. "One who devised the deception, and another who executed it. But which is the true author of this tragedy? That remains to be seen." Watson frowned. "You believe the lady herself may not have been the intended victim?" Holmes turned, eyes flashing with intensity. "Precisely. Every clue thus far. The feather in the fireplace, the broken music box, the footprints by the lake. They were not signs of her death, but of someone else's design. Consider the inscription upon the letter. When the swan sings at midnight, sorrow takes its final bow. That is not the voice of a killer, but of a playwright." Watson leaned forward. "Then the entire performance at the theatre, her so-called final act, was staged?" "Partly," Holmes replied, "but I suspect she was forced into the role she had written for another. A cruel irony, and one that may yet reveal the truth behind the Midnight Swan." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. "This just arrived for you, Mr. Holmes, from Inspector Lestrade." Holmes took it, unfolding the paper with deliberate care. His eyes darted across the message, and a faint smile flickered on his lips. "The body by the riverbank has spoken, figuratively at least. The coroner found traces of stage paint beneath the victim's nails, and fragments of white feathers scattered around the wound." Watson's brow furrowed. "Stage paint? Then the dead woman was—" "An actress," Holmes finished for him. "One who once performed under the same troupe as Lady Cavendish. Which means, my dear Watson, that the tragedy extends beyond mere jealousy or inheritance. It touches upon the theatre itself." He began pacing, each stride quick and precise, his mind spinning with silent calculations. "We must return to Drury Lane tonight. If my deductions are correct, there is one scene yet to be played, and our culprit intends to bring the curtain down before dawn." Moments later, they were in a cab, rattling through the misty streets of London. Gas lamps flickered in the fog like faint stars swallowed by smoke. Holmes sat rigid, his fingers drumming softly on his knee, eyes distant but alive with thought. The theatre, Watson, is a mirror of deceit. Every mask conceals not only the face but the motive. If we are to expose our villain, we must first attend their performance. When they arrived at Drury Lane, the theatre loomed dark and silent, its grand facade faded by years of soot and rain. Holmes slipped through the side entrance, guiding Watson with a hand gesture. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and old velvet. The stage lay before them like an abandoned altar, yet upon it stood a single object, a swan-shaped prop, its wings painted with a pearly sheen. "Curious," Holmes murmured, stepping closer. "A replica of the one found in the Cavendish garden, though clearly made for performance. Someone wished to recreate the tragedy here." A faint creak echoed from the rafters above. Holmes raised his lantern, illuminating the catwalks that spidered across the ceiling. "We are not alone," he whispered. Before Watson could reply, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man in a tattered stagecoat, his face pale beneath streaks of theatrical powder. He held a revolver, trembling. "Don't come any closer," the man cried. "It wasn't supposed to end this way." Holmes raised a calming hand. "Mr. Larkin, I presume, the stagehand dismissed after the final rehearsal." The man's eyes widened. How did you know my name?" "Because, my good fellow, only one man would have known how to manipulate both the theatre and the estate. You built the props, arranged the scenery, and I dare say helped Lady Cavendish design her illusion. But when she refused to let the performance become a crime, you took matters into your own hands." Larkin's grip on the revolver faltered. "She wanted to expose them all, the Baron, the director, every one of them. They stole her work, her words, her life. I only wanted justice." Holmes stepped closer, voice low but commanding. "Justice is not born from vengeance, Mr. Larkin. You turned art into execution, and your play into tragedy." The man's shoulders sagged, the revolver lowering slightly, but before he could surrender, a sharp click echoed from behind the stage. Another figure stepped into view, cloaked in black, a pistol gleaming in hand. "Enough sentiment, Larkin," the newcomer hissed. "You've spoken too much already. Holmes froze. The new arrival's voice carried the unmistakable cadence of power, a voice that belonged to Baron Fairchild himself. "Holmes," Watson muttered under his breath. "He means to silence us all." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Indeed, Watson. But as in every good performance, timing is everything, and I dare say the constables are waiting just beyond that door." At his cue, the sound of boots thundered through the aisles. Lestrade burst in with 2 officers, weapons drawn. Fairchild cursed, spinning toward the wings, but Holmes lunged forward with remarkable precision, striking the pistol from his hand. It clattered across the floor as the Baron was seized. "Your curtain has fallen, my lord," Holmes said quietly, "and like every vain actor, you mistook applause for absolution." As the policeman led the Baron and Larkin away, Watson exhaled, the tension finally breaking. "Holmes, how on earth did you anticipate his arrival?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because, my dear fellow, villains are as predictable as playwrights. They cannot resist a final act." He turned once more toward the stage, gazing at the Swan prop now glistening under the lantern light. "The tragedy of the Midnight Swan," he murmured, "was never truly about death but the illusion of it. And illusions, Watson, are merely truths in disguise." Outside, the fog began to lift, and the first light of dawn shimmered through the theatre windows, soft, pale, and cleansing, as though London itself sought to wash away the night's deceit. The soft light of dawn had scarcely broken through the haze when Holmes and I emerged from the theatre, our breath ghosting in the chill morning air. The gas lamps flickered low, their wan glow dancing upon the cobblestones, as though reluctant to illuminate what had transpired within those walls. The echoes of the night still lingered. The shot fired, the confession, the arrest, and yet I sensed Holmes's mind had not settled. His steps were brisk, his eyes alight with that peculiar restlessness that always followed the climax of a great revelation. "Watson," he said abruptly, his voice carrying that electric tone that meant his reasoning had not concluded, "does it strike you as curious that Fairchild risked everything to silence Larkin, when the man's confession had already sealed his own guilt?" I adjusted my coat against the cold. "You mean to say the Baron feared something beyond exposure?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "He feared a revelation yet unspoken. The question is, what truth did Larkin still withhold?" We had scarcely reached the corner of Drury Lane when Inspector Lestrade caught up with us, his boots scraping over the stones. "Holmes, we've secured the theatre, and both men are in custody. Larkin's already begun talking, though half of it sounds like madness. Something about the Swan's encore, and a performance that must be seen to be believed. I dare say he's lost his wits." Holmes halted, his eyes narrowing. "No, Lestrade. He's warning us." "The encore. He means there is another act, one yet to unfold. The play is not over." Lestrade's brows knitted. "You can't mean there's another crime to come?" Holmes's gaze swept eastward, toward the faint glimmer of the Thames through the fog. "Not to come, Inspector, to begin. The first performance was only rehearsal." Without another word, he hailed a passing cab. "Watson, Lestrade, quickly. We must return to Cavendish House at once." As the carriage rattled through the awakening city, the sky bled into a dim grey, the mist swirling like veils around the rooftops. Holmes sat motionless, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. I could tell from the gleam in his eyes that some new thread had been pulled from the tapestry of deceit. "The Baron," he began quietly, "was not the architect of this play, but its patron. He financed Lady Cavendish's final production under a false pretense to launder both his reputation and his fortune. The Midnight Swan was to be his monument, a masterpiece that immortalized them both. But when Lady Cavendish discovered his plan, she turned the play into an accusation, a confession performed in plain sight. Her disappearance, therefore, was not her death, but her escape." Lestrade stared. "You mean she's alive?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "I suspect so. The locket, the letter, the piano, they were all elements of a riddle she left for me. And if Larkin's words hold weight, then her final act is yet to be seen." We reached Cavendish House as the morning fog began to thin. The once grand estate loomed silent, its windows shrouded in grime and its gardens untended since the night of her supposed death. Holmes led the way to the drawing-room, where the scent of damp and decay hung in the air. The piano still stood by the window, its lid closed, its keys faintly dusted with ash from the old fire. Holmes's eyes darted to the instrument, his mind already racing. "Watson, do you recall the fragment of music we found folded inside the Swan locket?" "Of course." The refrain repeated twice, ending in a sharp minor chord. He nodded. "Play it." I hesitated only briefly before sitting at the piano. The melody was simple yet haunting, like a lullaby for the damned. When I struck the final chord, a faint metallic click echoed from within the frame of the instrument. Holmes's expression sharpened. He reached into the side panel, pried loose a small compartment, and withdrew a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter, written in Lady Cavendish's elegant hand. "To the one who follows the music to its end, know that the swan does not die, it merely changes its song. If you would uncover my truth, return to where the river mirrors the moon." Holmes's eyes lifted to mine. "The river mirrors the moon. Watson, she means the old theatre by the Thames, the one destroyed by fire years ago." "The Swan Playhouse," Lestrade groaned. "Another theatre!" "Blast it all, Holmes, you mean to chase ghosts through ruins now?" But Holmes was already moving. "Not ghosts, Inspector. An encore." The ride to the river was swift. The old playhouse stood like a skeleton against the pale dawn, its charred beams black against the mist. The air was heavy with the scent of wet ash and forgotten years. Yet amid the silence, faint music drifted from within, a single violin trembling with melancholy grace. Holmes motioned for silence. We entered cautiously, our footsteps echoing across the scorched floorboards. In the center of the stage stood a woman, her figure draped in grey silk, her back turned to us. The violin fell silent as she spoke. "I wondered," she said softly, "how long it would take you to find me, Mr. Holmes." "Lady Cavendish," Holmes replied, his voice low but steady. "You've performed your play well, but it is time the curtain fell." She turned, her face pale but serene, eyes glimmering like distant stars. "I could not allow him to destroy what I created. The Baron took everything from me, my name, my art, my life. I merely wrote him into the ending he deserved." Holmes studied her intently. "You let them believe you dead, knowing he would reveal himself in the act of silencing another. You built your justice upon deception." A faint smile touched her lips. "Justice, Mr. Holmes, is but another form of theatre. You of all men should know that." Before Holmes could answer, Lestrade and his men stepped forward, their torches catching the glint of steel in her hand, a small pistol. Ornate and trembling, "Lady Cavendish," Holmes said quietly, "do not end your story this way." She looked down at the weapon, then at the swan-shaped pendant around her neck. Slowly, she set both upon the stage. "The story ends as it began, in silence." Her gaze lifted toward the shattered roof, where the morning sun broke through the smoke-stained glass, spilling golden light upon the scene. "You were always meant to find me, Mr. Holmes. I left the trail for you not to accuse, but to remember." Holmes bowed his head slightly, his voice soft. "And remember I shall." As Lestrade approached to take her into custody, she raised her hands, surrendering without protest. The music ceased and the theatre fell utterly still, save for the soft whisper of the river beyond its walls. When we finally stepped outside, Holmes paused at the edge of the quay, watching the water ripple beneath the pale light. "The tragedy of the midnight swan," he murmured, "was not in her deceit, but in the truth it concealed, that even the purest art cannot survive corruption unscathed." I glanced toward him, uncertain what to say. He turned to me with a faint, wistful smile. "Come, Watson. There are no more acts to play today. London will have its drama again soon enough." And as we walked away from the dying echoes of her song, I could not help but feel that the swan's final note still lingered in the air, a haunting melody of love, justice, and the fragile illusion that bound them both. We left the Swan Playhouse in silence, the soft echo of the river murmuring behind us, like a final line in a tragedy that refused to end. The carriage wheels turned sluggishly over the slick cobblestones as London, grey and glistening in the aftermath of dawn, seemed to inhale once more after holding its breath through the long night. Holmes had not spoken since we departed, his profile etched in the pale light like the figure of a man listening to something only he could hear. For a time, I believed the case concluded, Lady Cavendish in custody, Fairchild exposed, and the river's secret at last brought to the surface. Yet as the cab rolled past the rows of shuttered shops, I saw Holmes's fingers begin their familiar tapping upon his knee, a restless cadence that told me his mind was still racing. "Watson," he said at last, "does anything in Lady Cavendish's story strike you as incomplete?" I looked at him, startled. "Incomplete, my dear Holmes? The woman confessed to fabricating her own death and orchestrating the downfall of the Baron. What more remains?" "Motives, my friend. Motives are seldom pure, even in art. Lady Cavendish's confession was a performance crafted for her own preservation, but not the whole truth. She claimed the Baron financed her final play to launder his fortune. Yet I believe it was she who sought him out, not the other way around." I frowned. "You suspect she lured him into the scheme?" "I suspect she wrote him into it," he replied softly. "Every line, every scene, every death, preordained in her script long before the first rehearsal. And there is one line that troubles me still. The swan does not die, it merely changes its song." I considered this in silence. A metaphor for rebirth, surely. Holmes gave a thin smile. Or for succession. We returned to Baker Street by mid-morning. The fire had long gone cold, and the room felt curiously lifeless without the hum of our habitual work. Holmes went immediately to his desk, scattering the remains of the night's papers, until he found the envelope containing the final pages of the Midnight Swan script. He spread them out before us, the ink faintly smudged but legible. "Observe, Watson. The final act ends with the swan sacrifice, but the curtain does not fall. Instead, there is a silent figure who steps forward, a watcher, unnamed, who closes the scene with a single gesture. I dismissed it before as poetic flourish. But what if this figure represents someone real, someone still unseen?" I leaned forward, reading the description aloud. "A man cloaked in shadow whose face is never shown. He observes but does not act. When all others fall, he remains, holding the key to the stage." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. The one who remains. Tell me, Watson, what do we know of Fairchild's finances? Only that he invested heavily in the theatre under assumed titles. And yet," Holmes continued, "it was Larkin, the stagehand, who managed the day-to-day accounts, who handled the ledgers, who received and distributed the Baron's checks. A curious responsibility for a mere assistant, don't you think? You mean he may have been more than a servant?" Holmes's voice dropped. "More than that. A partner. And perhaps a usurper." Before I could speak, a sharp knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, pale and breathless. "A letter for you, Mr. Holmes, delivered just now. The messenger said it was to be placed directly in your hands." Holmes took the envelope, examined the seal, unbroken, but marked with a faint impression of a swan's feather. His brows drew together. He opened it carefully, and as his eyes scanned the words, I saw the color drain slightly from his face. "What is it?" I asked. He passed me the note. The writing was Lady Cavendish's. "Mr. Holmes, there is one last truth I must entrust to you. The man you arrested at the theatre is not the Baron. The true Fairchild has been dead for months. The one you saw last night was his understudy." The silence that followed was absolute. Holmes rose, his movements deliberate, his gaze distant. "So," he murmured, "the Baron's tragedy was played twice, once by his victim and once by his shadow. Lestrade arrived not long after, looking harried and red-faced. Holmes, we've just come from the Yard. The man we have in custody claims to be Rupert Hallenby, an actor, not the Baron himself. Says he was hired to impersonate him during rehearsals and blackmailed into continuing the part when the play turned sinister." Holmes gave a thin, humorless laugh. "An understudy indeed. The perfect device. While we chased illusions across the stage, the true Baron vanished behind the curtain." Lestrade bristled. "Then where is he now?" "Gone," Holmes replied. "Or perhaps watching, as he always did." He turned to the window, the fog outside thick once more, curling like smoke around the lamps. The Midnight Swan was never merely a crime of passion. It was a production of control. The Baron directed from the shadows, orchestrating both guilt and innocence. And when the final curtain drew near, he simply stepped off the stage. "But Lady Cavendish, she'll testify," Lestrade insisted. Holmes shook his head. "She cannot. Her entire confession is entangled in her deception. To reveal the truth would condemn her as much as him. No, Inspector, our swan's song ends unresolved. The melody fades, but its echo remains." When Lestrade departed, Holmes sank into his chair, eyes fixed upon the dying embers of the hearth. "Watson," he said after a long pause, In theatre, as in crime, the audience sees only what the director allows. I fear we have been part of a performance greater than we imagined. I tried to lighten the mood. You solved the impossible, Holmes. Surely that counts for something. He smiled faintly, though his eyes were distant. Solved, yes, but not concluded. The midnight Swan has flown and London will sleep soundly tonight. But somewhere beyond the river's veil a hand still turns the page. The fire crackled softly. Outside a carriage passed, its wheels echoing like applause fading into the mist. Holmes reached for his violin, the instrument that so often carried his thoughts beyond reach. He drew the bow gently across the strings, and the melody that emerged was unmistakably familiar, the haunting refrain from the Midnight Swan's final act. I listened, transfixed, as the music swelled and then fell away, a sound both mournful and resolute. Holmes lowered the bow and spoke almost to himself. She wrote her vengeance as a lullaby, Watson. But vengeance, like music, cannot be contained by those who begin it. It escapes. It changes its song. He set the violin aside, the last note trembling in the air between us. We may not have found the Baron, but we have understood him, and that perhaps is the truer form of justice. As I closed my notebook, I realized that, in all the cases we had faced, none had felt quite so much like stepping into a dream, a play where the audience could not leave, and the truth itself was merely another performance. Holmes reclined in his chair, eyes half closed, as if already composing his next deduction. "Watson," he murmured, "make note of this day. The case of the Midnight Swan will not return to the papers, but it will, I think, remain in the music." And as the fog thickened once more beyond the window panes, I could almost swear I heard, faint and distant from the direction of the river, the echo of a woman's voice humming the same sorrowful refrain. The faint melody still lingered in the air when Holmes set his violin aside and rose from his chair. The flickering light of the hearth cast long, restless shadows across the sitting-room walls, as though echoing the disquiet that refused to leave his mind. I had seen Holmes restless before, after unsolved puzzles, incomplete investigations, but this was different. There was a quiet gravity in his expression, a contemplative depth that suggested the game had ended. Yet the pieces on the board had not ceased to move. "Watson," he said at last, gazing into the fire, "the most unsettling mysteries are not those that remain unsolved, but those that continue to live after their resolution." I looked up from my notebook. "You refer to Lady Cavendish, I presume?" He gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod. "And to her unseen accomplice. The letter, her confession, was intended to mislead, but not to protect herself. It was written to protect someone else." Before I could inquire further, a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a telegram. Holmes took it wordlessly, his eyes scanning the brief message before he handed it to me. "From Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard. Message, Cavendish gone. Escaped en route to Holloway. Guard found unconscious. No sign of struggle. She left a white feather pinned to his sleeve." Holmes's expression did not change, though the faint tightening of his jaw betrayed his agitation. "So," he murmured, "our Swan flies again." I stood incredulous. "Escaped? But how? She was under constant watch. Surely she could not have vanished into thin air." Holmes paced to the window, pulling aside the curtain to peer into the fog-choked street below. "A woman of her intellect does not vanish. She transitions. The feather is her calling card, a signal not of arrogance but of direction. She has set the next scene." I stepped beside him. "Do you mean to pursue her again?" "Of course," he said simply. "A play unfinished is an irritant to the mind. And besides," he added softly, "there is still one act left to perform. Within the hour, we were in Lestrade's office at Scotland Yard. The inspector, visibly irate, paced back and forth, his hat clutched in his hands. It's witchcraft, Holmes, that's what it is. The guards swear they never saw her leave. The door was locked, the windows barred, and yet she's gone, as though she melted into the air. Holmes, examining the feather under a magnifying lens, spoke without looking up. Not witchcraft, Lestrade, preparation. The feather is from the same species used in the theatre's costuming stock. Note the faint trace of arsenic dye along the shaft, used to preserve plumage from decay. But what's more intriguing is this. Look here. He passed the feather to me. Under the lens I saw the faintest smear of grey wax clinging to the quill's base. Sealing wax, I murmured. Holmes nodded. Precisely. A theatrical mark, used for envelopes, not props, which tells us this was no mere token, it sealed something. A message, perhaps, or an object she left behind as insurance. Lestrade threw up his hands. "Blast it all, Holmes, you speak in riddles. Where are we to find her?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Where her story began, by the river. The river has been her confidant since the first act, Lestrade. It swallowed her truth, and now, perhaps, it will return it." An hour later, the three of us stood once more upon the embankment near Blackfriars Bridge, the same stretch of fog-draped riverbank where the tragedy had begun. The morning tide lapped lazily against the stones, and the faint sound of a boatman's whistle drifted through the mist. Holmes crouched near the water's edge, his gaze scanning the wet stones. "Watson, observe this indentation. A narrow mark, recent as though from a pole. Small skiff has been here." Lestrade knelt beside him. "Could be any boatman." "Not quite," Holmes murmured. He drew from his pocket the fragment of grey wax, compared it against a small smear near the waterline, and nodded. "The same composition. She departed by river under disguise, no doubt aided by one who owed her allegiance. The only question is, to what end?" At that moment, the faint sound of distant bells reached us from across the Thames. Holmes looked up sharply. "Do you hear that, Watson?" "St. Bride's," I said. "The bells tolling for the early service." "Indeed," said Holmes, his eyes glinting. "And beneath St. Bride's lies the old Crypt Theatre, closed since the fire of '78, the place she called her first stage. Come. Watson, there lies our final curtain. We arrived at the church within the hour. The sexton, an elderly man with wary eyes, hesitated before granting us entry. "No one's been down there in years, sir," he said. "Not since the floodwaters near drowned the place." "Then we'll trouble it once more," Holmes replied, taking a lantern. The descent was narrow and steep. The air grew damp, heavy with the scent of stone and mildew. The flickering light revealed remnants of rotted timbers and the faint outline of a painted swan upon the crumbling wall, a relic from performances long forgotten. And then, from the darkness ahead came the sound of footsteps. "Steady, Watson," Holmes whispered. A figure emerged from the shadows, Lady Cavendish herself, pale and serene, her grey cloak trailing behind her like smoke. She regarded us without surprise. "You always were punctual, Mr. Holmes," she said softly. "Not punctual enough, it seems," he replied. "You have escaped the gallows once more." Her smile was tinged with sorrow. "Escape? No, Mr. Holmes, merely returning to the beginning. This is where my story was written, beneath the earth where no applause can reach." Holmes's tone sharpened. "The Baron, where is he?" She hesitated, then turned her gaze toward the far corner of the crypt. There, half submerged in shadow, lay a form draped in a dark cloak. Holmes moved swiftly, pulling the lantern close. The face beneath was unmistakable. Baron Fairchild, cold and still, his eyes staring toward the ceiling with the vacant look of death. "He came to me last night," Lady Cavendish said quietly. "He could not bear his exile. He begged me to vanish with him, to begin anew. But his story was already finished." Lestrade stepped forward. "You poisoned him," she did not flinch. "No, Inspector. He poisoned himself long before I ever met him, with vanity, deceit, and the illusion of control." Holmes's expression softened, though his voice remained measured. "You could have surrendered, Lady Cavendish. You could have ended this play with grace." Her eyes met his, shimmering in the half-light. "And ruin the illusion." "No, Mr. Holmes. Some tragedies must remain unresolved, lest the audience forget their beauty." She withdrew a final white feather from her cloak and placed it gently atop the Baron's still chest. "The swan sings but once," she whispered. Before Lestrade could reach her, she stepped backward into the pool of rising water near the crypt's edge, her reflection rippling like glass. For an instant she seemed to dissolve into the mist. Then she was gone. We searched, of course, every tunnel, every passage, but there was no sign of her body. Only the faint echo of her words, carried by the whisper of the river through the stone halls. Later, as we emerged into the pale light of morning, Holmes paused by the churchyard gate. "She has completed her story, Watson. The midnight swan has sung her final note." I looked at him, uncertain whether to feel relief or sorrow. "And the Baron?" Holmes drew a deep breath, his gaze lingering on the distant water. He was but her instrument, a melody she could no longer endure. In destroying him, she destroyed herself. Such is often the price of genius unrestrained. He turned, his coat fluttering in the rising wind. "Come, Watson. The river keeps her secrets now. Let us leave it to its silence." And as we walked away, the sun broke faintly through the fog, glinting on the rippling Thames. For a moment I fancied I saw a single white feather drifting upon the current, turning, gliding, then sinking softly beneath the surface, as though the Swan's song had finally mercifully reached its end. Holmes stood silently by the embankment, long after the police had departed, his gaze fixed upon the slow, unhurried tide of the Thames. The dawn mist had begun to lift, revealing the grey expanse of the river glinting faintly beneath the first weak light of morning. He had not spoken in several minutes, and I, out of long acquaintance, knew better than to disturb him when his thoughts lingered in such depths. Finally he exhaled softly. "Watson," he murmured, "every case, however dark, must conclude with balance restored. And yet in this instance, I cannot help but feel that balance has been achieved only in tragedy." I turned toward him. "You mean Lady Cavendish?" "Precisely." He adjusted his collar against the wind, his voice reflective but edged with melancholy. "She was neither villain nor victim. Rather, she was both, the architect of her own ruin. The Baron's corruption was her catalyst, but her mind, brilliant though it was, proved her undoing. She believed herself the author of fate, yet even she could not control the final chapter." He paused, gazing once more toward the water. "When she vanished beneath that current, she did not escape justice, Watson. She embraced it. I felt a pang of sorrow. Do you think she's truly gone?" Holmes's eyes followed the faint current, as though reading some hidden message upon its surface. "Bodies may sink, but stories have a way of resurfacing. In time, perhaps some fisherman will draw her from the depths, or perhaps she will remain a whisper in the fog. Has she preferred?" He reached into his coat and withdrew a small envelope, sealed with grey wax and stamped with the faint impression of a swan. I started. "Where did you find that?" "In the crypt near the stage wall," Holmes replied. "She left it deliberately. It was never meant for the yard, it was meant for us." He handed it to me, and with a tremor of curiosity, I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a delicate looping script. "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you sought the truth and you found it. But the truth, once uncovered, can no longer be caged. The Baron was but the shadow cast by my own light. I do not ask for pardon, only remembrance. Let the river carry me where it will. The play is ended." L.C. Holmes read the letter over my shoulder, his expression inscrutable. "Remarkable," he said at last. "Even in farewell she seeks to shape the narrative." Lestrade approached then, his boots crunching on the damp gravel. "We've dragged the lower tunnels, Holmes. No sign of her. The current's too strong this morning. She'll be halfway to Greenwich by now if she's gone that way at all." Holmes gave a single nod. "Then leave her to the river, Lestrade. The law can pursue only the living." Lestrade grunted, clearly dissatisfied, but made no argument. "I'll file the report as you say. But between you and me, Holmes, I can't shake the feeling she wanted it this way." "She did," Holmes replied quietly. "Every act, every gesture. She choreographed her own end with precision. Even the feather upon the Baron's chest was symbolic, purity tainted by obsession. She died as she lived, in performance." When the inspector departed, Holmes and I turned back toward Baker Street, the fog closing behind us like a drawn curtain. The city was waking. The hum of carriages and the faint cry of newspaper boys filled the air. Yet in the midst of London's familiar din, the memory of the crypt lingered, cold, echoing, eternal. Back at our lodgings, Holmes moved directly to his desk and placed the letter within a thin portfolio marked The Midnight Swan. He secured it with a ribbon, as though sealing away the final echo of a lament long concluded. "Will you publish it?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "No. The world delights in resolution, but not all truths must be told. To reveal her tale would be to rob it of its grace. Let history speak of Lady Cavendish as it will. The rest is for the river." He turned toward the fireplace where the last embers glowed faintly, and added almost absently, "You may, however, note it among my records, Watson. File it under an inquiry into the nature of tragic genius." I smiled faintly, sensing the faint return of his characteristic composure. "And what of you, Holmes? Will you rest now that the case is done?" His lips curved into that rare, elusive smile. "Rest, my dear Watson, is for those content with endings. For me there is only the next question, the next pursuit. The game as ever goes on." He took up his violin once more, the bow gliding gently across the strings. The melody that emerged was soft, reflective, half elegy, half benediction. As I listened, I fancied I heard the faint murmur of the river outside, mingling with the music, as though the Thames itself had taken up the refrain. And when the final note faded, Holmes lowered the instrument and said, almost to himself, "The Swan has sung, Watson, but somewhere in the fog another song begins." Outside, London carried on, unaware that one of its most haunting tragedies had just met its end. Yet within that small sitting room at Baker Street, I could not shake the feeling that Lady Cavendish's spirit lingered, not as a ghost but as a memory, graceful and tragic, forever drifting upon the waters of the city she had both loved and defied. Holmes closed the violin case, his expression serene once more. "Come, Watson," he said, reaching for his coat. "There is work to be done, and the day awaits no man, even one who has just buried a ghost." And with that, we stepped into the London morning, leaving behind the mystery of the midnight Swan, its secrets now carried away on the silent, eternal current of the Thames.